It's no secret that Pokemon likes to hint at what's coming next. This has kind of been a really thing people love talking about. I've talked about it on this channel a ton of times, and also it's something that people are always looking for in games. But sometimes things kind of just get lucky, right? Like sometimes Pokemon will say something and then over 10 years later, that thing will kind of just age well. Like it's very likely these were not hints, but just examples of times that Pokemon did something and it actually aged really well. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome back to the Lumiose Post, where we talk about all things Pokemon, and today we are talking about Pokemon references or Pokemon things in the Pokemon world that just aged really, really well because of stuff that came along later. As we get into the list, you'll see what I'm talking about. So first up, we have way back in Generation 1, we have a character who's right outside of, I believe, a rock tunnel, who will talk about how, oh, I'm not a big fan of the Pokemon here, and, they go on to say, there should be a pink Pokemon with a floral pattern. Now, this is in Generation 1, which came out in 1996, but 14 years later, we would get Pokemon Black and White, and one of the Pokemon introduced in this game would be Munna, which is a Pokemon that is pink with a floral pattern. So it's very likely that given the 14-year gap, Pokemon was not teasing Munna 14 years ahead of its time, but this just kind of aged pretty well because there did end up being a pink Pokemon with a floral pattern. Number 2, in Generation 6, Pokemon X and Y, which are some of my most favorite games, if you couldn't tell by the name being Lumiose Post. These games have an area called the Parfum Palace, and in the Parfum Palace, there's a lot of statues of Pokemon. In the gardens, there's a Zekrom and Reshiram statue. There's a superior, design on the gates to the Parfum Palace, and then there's also inside of the palace a bunch of B-Sharp statues. Okay, whatever. B-Sharp was just the last gym before it. Gym 5 came right before Gen 6, if you can believe it. So it makes sense that, yeah, they're referencing a bunch of stuff that came right before it. But then there's also another statue here. It's this statue that seems to look like a soldier, and it has like a giant sword piece coming out of the top of its head. Now, this game came out in 2013, but in 2022, we would get Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, B-Sharp did get a new evolution called Kingambit. Interestingly enough, Kingambit also has a giant sword emerging from the top of its head. So, while this is, 9 years before Kingambit was a thing, so it's likely that this wasn't a reference to it. It's kind of interesting that it's a bunch of B-Sharp statues, and then a bunch of statues that don't look exactly like Kingambit, but almost seem like a reference to it. Like, if this game was a Generation 8 game, and we saw this, I think we would all assume that this was a hint to Kingambit, in hindsight. I don't think that's the case here, but again, it's just something that aged really, really well. Number 3, we have a kind of interesting one, because this is actually something that aged kind of badly, and then they did something to fix it and make it age correctly. So we have Raichu's Dex entry in Generation 1. Raichu's Dex entry talks about how it is powerful enough to be able to take down an Indian elephant. Now, this was weird at the time, because I'm, playing Pokemon. There are no animal. What's an Indian elephant? I'm playing Pokemon. Furthermore, there's no Indian elephant Pokemon in Generation 1. But then in Generation 2, we get Donphan, an elephant Pokemon. However, the thing is, Donphan's a ground type, so Raichu can't shock it. So again, it's kind of like, okay, well, if the Indian elephant was a reference to Donphan, that still doesn't make sense. But then, several years later, in Generation 8, which came out in 2019, we get the Pokemon Copperajah, and Copperajah is a Steel-type Pokemon, so it would be able to be hit by Raichu's electric attacks. So, maybe Copperajah is the Indian Elephant. Well then, interestingly enough, in Pokemon Legends Arceus, if you look at Raichu's Dex entry, all these Dex entries are written by Professor Laventon, who is from the Galar region, which is where Copperajah lives. And he mentions in Raichu's Dex entry that it would be powerful enough to take down a Copperajah. So they kind of retcon this Pokedex entry to be referring to Copperajah, and it does make sense with it when you look at it all together. But it's a fun little roller coaster, because it's like, oh, there is no Indian elephant, Also, the Indian Elephant Pokemon we now have is ground type. Oh wait, no, it's this Indian Elephant Pokemon. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. For this next one, we're actually not going to be looking at the games, but instead looking at the anime. So in the anime, there are a ton of cool little Easter eggs they do. Like, the first episode's well known for having Ho-Oh, and a lot of Pokemon appear before their time in the anime. Like, that was kind of the thing back in the day, was that, oh, you have Blaziken defeat Ash in the Johto League. Oh, Brock catches a Bonsai, may catch a Munchlax one generation before they're in the games. Things like that. But there's one thing that's really interesting from the Generation 2 anime. When they get to Blackthorn City, they are basically kind of tasked with helping Claire perform this ritual that the Blackthorn City gym leader has always performed that involves the Dragon Fang. And basically what happens is they do this ritual and like a beam of light shoots out of it and it looks like a dragon and it flies up into space. And Brock even makes a comment where he goes, "Oh, it's the light dragon." Now, this, at the time, is just like, oh, that's a cool little thing. But this is actually really interesting and ages really well. This is possibly my favorite one on the list because we actually see in Generation 7, so 5 generations later, in Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, or Pokemon Sun and Moon, you have Necrozma. And specifically in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, we get to see its Ultra form, the Ultra Necrozma form, which is just a dragon made out of light. So it is quite literally a light dragon. Interestingly enough, them kind of tying it to stars is just kind of neat because there was a lot of fan speculation back when Sun and Moon came out that the third version of Sun and Moon would be called Pokemon Stars and that it would involve Necrozma. Now, that didn't end up happening. It was Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, but that is kind of interesting. Then also, it's neat too because if you kind of look at the lore, it can be assumed that the people who settled in Blackthorn City were once a kind of journeying people, and they may have come across the Alola region. As we know, Jotonians did arrive in the Johto region the Alola region, as Melee City was formed by a lot of Kanto and Johto residents. And it stands to reason that what if these Johto travelers, or soon-to-be Johto travelers, these dragon people, come across the Seafolk village. They learn about the altar of the sun or moon, and basically just kind of hear about some of the legends of the Alola region, and they learn about a light dragon. They kind of take that with them. Perhaps that Dragon Fang is even from Alola. Like, again, all of this was definitely not planned by Pokemon, but it's something that, like, the future games, the things that would come after this anime episode, would kind of uplift it and make it seem more plausible and more, like, make more sense. I love this so much. Now, for our final one, we have in Pokemon Black and White, Lenora's Gym. Now, when you go inside Lenora's Gym, it's actually a library, and like you're tasked with kind of, going around, clicking different books, looking for clues on how to get to the gym leader. But interestingly enough, there's one bit that stands out in this library. There are on a top shelf where you kind of can't even get to them. There is a Scarlet book right next to a Violet book. Okay, well, it's 2010, I'm playing Black and White. That doesn't mean anything. I'm not even thinking anything about that. But interestingly enough, in just 12 years, we would get Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. And an interesting thing about this is that these games, kind of the MacGuffin of these games, was the was the Scarlet book and the Violet book, depending on the version that you're playing. So it's kind of interesting to see that Unova had this Scarlet book next to a Violet book. Not only would there be a Scarlet and Violet game, but they would revolve around a Scarlet book and a Violet book. And then, if that's not even enough for you, in Scarlet and Violet's DLC, we actually do return to the Unova region. So it's just the Blueberry Academy. We don't really get anything. Lenora's not even in it. I'm not even positive that Lenora is mentioned or referenced anywhere. But all of that just kind of seems like, again, if Black and White was last gen, if it was at Generation 8, we would totally be like, okay, well, that was definitely a hint. I don't know that was, because 12 years before seems like a long time for Pokemon to be cooking this up. But that definitely is interesting to me. But yeah, so there are some examples of times that Pokemon just kind of said something or did something, and then that ended up being aged really, really well, like 10 years later, so much longer. And I love this idea, and I love that there's probably things that are mysteries or kind of just funny things right now that 10 years from now might be like, oh, that could be this, you know, and probably isn't, but it works, you know. Let me know more examples of these if you can think of them in the comments below. Be sure to let me know what your favorite on this list is. Be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss all our future videos. And until next time, I will see all of you later.